It's 8:40 a.m. on the 6th of December, 1917, in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Young William Paul is watching a curious event unfold. From the dock at Tufts Cove, he sees two ships approaching each other in the narrow waterway between Dartmouth and Halifax, Nova Scotia. The incoming ship blows its whistle, and he sees sailors waving and shouting at another ship, which blasts its whistle 2 times in response. Many ships travel in and out of the busy port of Halifax, and William enjoys watching them steam by. But this seemed different. Others now gathered around him, watching the 2 ships approach on a collision course. Again, the ships blow their whistles at each other. At the last minute, they try to avoid a collision, but it was too late. They collide with a thud. The sound of grinding metal rings out as the ships separate from each other. The incoming ship veers off across the water toward the pier at Halifax. The outgoing ship chugs on towards the mouth of the harbor, so close William could read the words "Belgian Relief" painted on its side. World War I had been raging for 3 years now, and seeing warships and supply ships in Halifax harbor was commonplace. He glances across the water and sees the other ship is now on fire. Black smoke is billowing high into the air. He is gripped with excitement, as even more people now line the waterfront. Moments later, 2 small boats appear, heading his way. It is the crew of the flaming ship, and they are shouting something in French, although he doesn't understand. But another onlooker does understand, and he screams, "Run! The ship is going to blow!" Frightened spectators suddenly dash from the dock, fleeing down the streets for their homes. William runs home to the nearby Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove. He shouts to his mother of what he has just seen and the warning of the imminent explosion. Mrs. Mary Catherine Paul is pregnant and busily taking care of the household and her infant daughter Madeline. William's mother dismisses him. She has no time for the wild imaginations of the young boy. Again, William pleads with her to run away, but she is not having it. A moment later, she hears several popping sounds, like small explosions. Curious, she looks out of her window toward the water. Just then, she sees a blinding flash of light, and then hears a deafening sound. The rumbling shockwave of a horrible explosion then ripped across the water and into her village, destroying everything in its path. In her book, Curse of the Narrows, Laura MacDonald writes, "At Turtle Grove, William Paul's mother awoke on the ground. A baby was crying. It sounded muffled, as if she were swaddled too tightly. Mrs. Paul stood up, her dress hanging off of her in strips. It was dark. Smoke obscured the outlines of the buildings, and she could not see her house. Mrs. Paul cocked her ear to listen for the crying Madeline, but every few seconds, something crashed out of the sky and exploded next to her. It was hard to concentrate. She shuffled over a pile of timber that she only then recognized as her house. She dug, until she exposed part of the stove. It was intact and upright on its curled feet, but the oven door was ajar. Mrs. Paul pulled open the door and looked inside. Baby Madeline was lying on top of a bed of hot coals. The back of her swaddling was scorched and her back burned. She was screaming vigorously. The Halifax Explosion of 1917, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. There have been countless maritime disasters ever since humans began traversing the seas. Some are celebrated and remembered, being retold in novels and glitzy Hollywood films. Many others have been largely ignored, forgotten, or overshadowed by other world events. The 1917 Halifax Explosion is one such event. While certainly not forgotten, it has not received the attention of other disasters, such as the Titanic or Lusitania. The massive death tolls along the Western Front during World War I were commonplace in the daily news, and hearing of such things made the public desensitized. But for the people of Halifax and Dartmouth, as well as Nova Scotia as a whole, the 1917 Halifax explosion was catastrophic. The loss and grief of the event would be remembered for all time. The city of Halifax has been a significant port city since its inception in 1749, when Colonel Edward Cornwallis arrived aboard the Sphinx. Although named after the second Earl of Halifax, the native Mi'kmaq people had inhabited Nova Scotia for 13,000 years, and called Halifax and its harbor Chibuktuk, meaning Great Harbor. Cornwallis saw this as the perfect strategic location for a fortified city, to oppose the French fortress at Louisbourg. 2,500 colonists arrived along with Cornwallis, and soon a bustling town emerged. To encourage colonization, the British government offered every colonist free land, as well as supplies and rations for a year. Most of the colonists were British, but the contingent also included Swiss, Irish, and European Jews. A second wave of colonists arrived from Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, and southern France. While Halifax was growing as a settlement, the main purpose of colonizing the city was not forgotten, and it developed into a garrison city. Raids on French fortifications were planned and launched from Halifax Harbor, including the decisive assaults on Louisbourg in 1758 and Quebec in 1759. Over time, an extensive system of fortifications called the Halifax Defense Complex was built, including the original Halifax Citadel in 1749, Fort Charlotte on George's Island in 1750, York Redoubt in 1793, and Fort McNab on McNab's Island in 1892. The Halifax Citadel underwent several modifications, eventually being renamed Fort George, and then renamed back to the Halifax Citadel as it still is today. Halifax Harbor's deep channel, year-round ice-free waters, sheltered anchorage, and proximity to Atlantic shipping lanes make it perfect for both naval and commercial use. For over 250 years, Halifax has been a crucial hub for merchant ships delivering cargo, naval ships, ocean liners, and cruise ships. In 2023, over 4.6 million metric tons of cargo were delivered to Halifax, and 178 cruise ships called at its port. When the United Kingdom declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, Canada was thrust into the conflict as a dominion of the United Kingdom. Despite being across the Atlantic, Canadians prepared for war. By October 3, 1914, the 1st Canadian contingent of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, consisting of 33,000 soldiers and 7,000 horses, departed for Europe. While the war raged, Canada's economy boomed. The war created a tremendous demand for supplies, ammunition, artillery, rations, timber, and equipment, which provided jobs and helped pull Canada out of its recession. Massive resources were required to help arm and feed its troops, and that of the United Kingdom. However, the massive amount of capital required to fund the war also caused inflation and quadrupled its national debt. At the center of this commerce was Halifax. Its pre-war population of 50,000 surged as military personnel and civilian workers flocked to the busy port. As North America's closest port to Europe, Halifax also served as the primary point of departure for troops heading to Europe. Canadian, British Commonwealth, and American soldiers, plus civilian personnel, boarded ships in Halifax by the thousands to join the war effort. British Royal Navy controlled the port, where its ships were a mainstay. The Royal Canadian Navy was quite small and in the process of rebuilding at this time. Along with its own vessels, the Canadian Navy used boats donated by private citizens for the war effort. Based out of Halifax, patrols guarded the coastal waters in and around Nova Scotia from German U-boats. Throughout the course of the war, sailors in the Canadian Navy grew from 350 to over 5,000. In addition to naval ships, Halifax was critical for cargo ships. Wheat, coal, artillery shells, ammunition, rations, and other cargo were sent to the port by Canada's Intercolonial Railroad, and loaded onto cargo ships bound for Europe. Starting in 1917, convoys from Halifax, called HX convoys, consisted of groups of merchant cargo vessels and troop ships, along with naval escort ships. German U-boats were a constant threat, and the use of convoys significantly reduced the loss of Allied ships. The Halifax Defense Complex offered formidable protection for the city during World War I. The port and town bustled with activity, with warships continuously patrolling the area. Gun emplacements dotted the coastline, observation posts scanned the harbor, and underwater nets were stretched across the harbor's entrance to prevent U-boat infiltration. Nevertheless, citizens of Halifax were ever fearful of being shelled by German battleships, U-boats, or even being invaded. On the 6th of December 1917, the Norwegian vessel Imo sat in Bedford Basin, the large enclosed bay to the northwest of Halifax. Bedford Basin is connected to Halifax Harbor by a tight waterway, aptly called the Narrows, which separates the twin cities of Halifax and Dartmouth. Norway was officially neutral during World War I, although its sympathies certainly lied with the Allies. The Imo's mission was to pick up supplies in Halifax and New York and deliver them to war-torn Belgium. Belgian civilians were suffering greatly as a result of Germany's now infamous Rape of Belgium, and were in desperate need of relief. Painted on the sides of the Imo in large block letters were the words, "Belgian Relief," clearly announcing the ship's mission. The Imo had arrived in Halifax several days earlier on the 3rd of December. After being inspected as a neutral ship entering the port, it was permitted to enter Bedford Basin. It was scheduled to depart on the 5th of December. However, its delivery of coal had been delayed, and the harbor submarine nets had already been raised for the night before it could depart. Its departure would have to wait until the following day. While the Imo was anchored in Bedford Basin, the French munitions vessel Mont-Blanc was entering Halifax Harbor. It was carrying extremely dangerous cargo consisting of 500 tons of TNT, 2,300 tons of another explosive called picric acid, 10 tons of highly flammable gun cotton, and 35 tons of the high-octane fuel benzol. A ship carrying hazardous cargo would normally fly a red flag into the harbor during peacetime, but this requirement was eliminated as the British Admiralty did not wish to announce its cargo to German U-boats. The Mont-Blanc was under orders to transport its explosive chemicals from New York to Bordeaux by way of Halifax. Its cargo would help fuel the French war effort on the Western Front. After anchoring offshore of Halifax overnight, the Mont-Blanc entered Halifax Harbor at approximately 7:30 a.m. on the 6th of December, just after the submarine net between George's Island and Pier 21 was opened for the morning. The harbor pilot aboard Mont-Blanc, Francis Mackey, had requested a guard ship as he was concerned about the ship's volatile cargo. But no guard ship was assigned, and the Mont-Blanc continued on its own. Despite the cargo, no restrictions were placed on other ships in the harbor. It was business as usual. At the same time, pilot William Hayes on board the Imo was given permission by HMS Acadia to leave Bedford Basin and enter the Narrows. The Imo proceeded through the Narrows at a higher speed than was permitted, or advisable, as its captain wanted to make up for lost time. Another ship, SS Clara, was inbound for Bedford Basin, approaching on the southern side of the channel. This forced the Imo to make a starboard-to-starboard passing and move into the center of the channel. The ships passed without incident. Soon after, the tug Stella Maris approached inbound, towing 2 sailing barges. The Stella Maris was in the dead center of the channel, as towing barges is rather unwieldy, especially in a very tight waterway such as the Narrows. Pilot Hayes swung the Imo even further over to the north half of the channel, closer to Dartmouth, to make room for the tug. Meanwhile, Mont-Blanc had passed through the Halifax inner harbor and approached the Narrows when it first spotted the Imo, a little over a kilometer ahead. Mont-Blanc was properly on the northern side of the Narrows. Its pilot, Francis Mackey, became concerned as the Imo was in his path on the wrong side of the channel. Mackey sounded a single blast of the ship's whistle, indicating that his ship had the right of way. In response, Imo sounded 2 blasts, a signal that his ship would hold its course. The Imo continued, and Mackey ordered Mont-Blanc to slow to half speed, and also a slight change in course, taking the ship closer to the Dartmouth shore. Mackey considered grounding the Mont-Blanc to avoid a collision, but thought better of it considering his dangerous cargo. He signaled another blast, but again, the Imo sounded 2 blasts of its whistle, refusing to change course. The Imo slowed its engines, but the ships remained on a collision course. Mackey ordered the Mont-Blanc hard to port to move his ship to the middle of the channel, in hopes Imo would slip past his starboard side. People on the shores of Dartmouth and Halifax were busily heading to work and school and starting their days. They gathered around the waterfronts after hearing the commotion and watched as the ships strangely continued toward each other. Trying to avoid a collision, pilot William Hayes on the Imo sounded 3 blasts, signaling its engines were in reverse. With crewmen shouting and waving at each other, the Imo's bow struck the Mont-Blanc amidships at 8:45 a.m. Those watching from shore witnessed the collision and the ships grinding past each other. It did not appear to be an especially violent collision, and neither ship was in any danger of sinking. The jolt of the collision caused the barrels of benzol on the Mont-Blanc to spill over, and the dangerous liquid splashed all over its deck. As their metal hulls scraped against each other, sparks flew, igniting the spilled benzol. Mont-Blanc's forward deck was ablaze, and clouds of toxic black smoke billowed 3 kilometers in the sky. The fire and smoke attracted the attention of even more onlookers. Citizens crowded along the waterfront, and women and children at home pressed against their windows to get a glimpse of the flaming ship. This was both entertaining and concerning, but nobody could have possibly known of the highly flammable cargo on board the Mont-Blanc. The burning ship drifted toward the shore of Richmond, the small suburb at the north end of Halifax, while the Imo tried to make it out to sea. Dockworkers, shopkeepers, children, and other citizens lined the waterfront in just minutes. The captain of the Mont-Blanc, Aimé le Médec, ordered his men to abandon ship, and the men quickly boarded the ship's 2 lifeboats. All of Mont-Blanc's cargo was meant for exploding munitions, and it was burning out of control. With the fire now igniting vapors inside the hull, flames erupted from the sides of the ship at the waterline. As the crew rowed toward the shores of Dartmouth, they shouted warnings to other nearby ships that the Mont-Blanc was going to blow. Most were too enthralled with the sight of the flaming ship, and either didn't hear them, didn't understand French, or simply ignored their pleas. As the benzol began to boil inside the barrels, they exploded, sending the flaming barrels shooting skyward like fireworks. It was quite a display, and attracted even more to the waterfront to witness the event. The blazing hulk of Mont-Blanc drifted lazily toward Pier 6, where Richmond Street ended at the waterfront. Chief Clerk William Levitt of the nearby railway yard learned of the deadly cargo on board the Mont-Blanc and quickly spread the word to others and sent a message to another railway agent down the line. Dispatcher Vincent Coleman, who controlled rail traffic coming in and out of Halifax, received the message and relayed the danger to stop the incoming train from St. John. Coleman tapped out the message: "Munition ship on fire, making for Pier 6. Goodbye." Halifax Fire Chief Edward P. Condon arrived on the scene with his crew of volunteer firefighters, along with 2 fire engines and a hose wagon. They desperately tried to prevent the blaze from engulfing the wharf and spreading to the surrounding homes and businesses. On the water, the tug Stella Maris disengaged from the barges it had been towing, turned around, and raced to Pier 6 to assist. But its single fire hose made no impact on the blaze, and its captain, Horatio H. Brannan, ordered the tug to back away. With 2 other nearby ships, the Stella Maris attempted, unsuccessfully, to pull the Mont-Blanc away from the pier by attaching a line to the stern. At 9:04 a.m., the 2.6 million kilograms of explosives on board the Mont-Blanc exploded in a monumental blast of destruction. A shockwave ripped through Halifax, equal to the force of 2.9 kilotons of TNT, at a speed of 4,900 feet per second, and was felt as far away as Cape Breton, 366 kilometers away, and Prince Edward Island. Windows were shattered in Truro, 100 kilometers away. Off the coast of Massachusetts, over 120 nautical miles away, the crew aboard the fishing boat Wave claimed to have heard the explosion. In his book, The Halifax Explosion, December 6, 1917, author Graham Metzen writes, "The people in Lawrencetown, 20 kilometers away, felt something like a blow in the face and then a sort of recoil or pull back in the opposite direction." In the immediate blast zone, there was utter devastation. More than 1,600 people were instantly killed. Temperatures in the blast zone reached 5,000 degrees Celsius, or 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The shock wave destroyed internal organs and propelled bodies at great speeds against stone and brick. Fences, trees, shredded metal, and shards of glass became deadly projectiles. Entire families ceased to exist in a split second as their houses collapsed and crumbled on top of them. Children in schools, workers in factories, rail yards, and dockyards were instantly wiped out. Everything within an 800-meter blast radius was completely obliterated, and any structure within an area of 1.6 square kilometers, or about 400 acres, was destroyed. The suburb of Richmond was wiped from the map, and the thriving, bustling metropolitan cities of Halifax and Dartmouth were stopped in their tracks. The devastation from the blast was mostly in the northern and eastern section of Halifax, while Citadel Hill largely shielded the southern and western areas of the city from the worst of the explosion. The destruction extended across the Narrows to Dartmouth as well. At least 100 were killed, as houses and buildings along the waterway were leveled. Windows were smashed all over Dartmouth, and debris rained down on the city. The Mont-Blanc was obliterated, sending flaming chunks of metal and the vaporized remnants of the ship soaring 20,000 feet into the air. A black rain of debris and water bombarded the surrounding areas, pelting the throttled survivors even further. A portion of Mont-Blanc's anchor, weighing over 1,100 pounds, was found 4 kilometers away from the epicenter, in western Halifax. It was fashioned into a monument to the destruction, where it still lies today. One of its gun barrels was blasted 3.5 miles, landing at Albro Lake in Dartmouth. The massive fireball boiled the water around the blast, and blasted away the water, rocking and tossing nearby ships in the harbor. The Imo was tossed like a toy boat onto its side along the shores of Dartmouth. Dozens of sailors on board ships were killed by projectiles that shredded everything in their path. Bert Griffith, aboard HMCS Niobe, saw the Mont-Blanc instantly disappear in a flash and was thrown down on the deck. He survived the blast, later writing to his wife that he saw something coming, can't describe it. There was an awful noise, then all kinds of things falling. It was shrapnel and bits of the side of the ship. Fire Chief Condon and all but one of his firefighters were killed in the blast, as were radio dispatcher Vincent Coleman and Chief Railway Clerk William Lovett. Moments after the devastation, there was an eerie quiet, but sadly, this was just the beginning. The blast had temporarily exposed the bottom of the harbor, as the water had been displaced outward. This water came roaring back as a tsunami, and it washed violently across Halifax and Dartmouth. 80 crewmen of the Karaka and Colon were killed when their ships were tossed across the harbor by a 20-foot wave. Smaller ships and boats were wholly obliterated. Structures that were not destroyed by the blast were washed away by the tsunami. Devastated survivors buried in the rubble were suddenly drowned in the ensuing flood. Tufts Cove, where the Mont-Blanc's crew landed in their lifeboats in Dartmouth, was hit by a 20-foot surge of water, which crashed down over people, houses, and boats. Trees were uprooted and washed away. Buildings that existed just seconds earlier no longer were there. Located here was the small, ancient Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove. The Nova Scotia Archives includes the names of William Paul and Mary Catherine Paul, who you heard at the beginning of this episode, among the dead, although other sources indicate the family survived. Their fate, as well as others from the approximate 27 Mi'kmaq families, is unclear, but the Turtle Grove community was obliterated. The Mi'kmaq presence in this area had long been a bitter source of hatred for white citizens, and sadly, Turtle Grove was never rebuilt, and its people were forever displaced. Sailor Frank Baker wrote in his diary, "It is beyond me to describe the absolute terror of the situation. For miles around, nothing but a flaming inferno. Fires broke out on ships all around, and hundreds of small crafts had been blown to hell. The sea presented an awful scene of debris and wreckage. What had been beautiful vessels were now terrible wrecks, their crews all dead, and bodies, arms, etc. were floating around in the water." Of the devastation, author Graham Metzen writes, "All dwellings had been swept away, and the streets were filled with the strangest apparitions. Men, women, and children, with their faces, chalk white with terror, or black with the black rain and smeared with blood. The dead, the dying, and the severely injured lay about the streets amid ghastly, bleeding fragments of what had been human beings' heads and limbs. When the tsunami subsided, stunned civilians were joined by garrison soldiers and sailors from the harbor. They roamed the streets like specters, not fully yet comprehending what had happened. Rumors even spread of a German attack. An increasing number of people arrived in Richmond, at the epicenter of the blast, and searched desperately for survivors. Some battled fires that had popped up out of the carnage and threatened to destroy the little that remained. Gas lines and electricity were shut off, and the telephone and telegraph lines had been destroyed. Communication was impossible. George Graham, head of Dominion Atlantic Railway, and W.A. Duff, a civil engineer with Intercolonial Railway, each walked to the nearest undamaged telegraph station at Bedford Basin, informed their headquarters of the disaster, and requested assistance. In the streets, parents searched for their children, and men who rushed home from work tried to reconnect with their families. Many would find nothing but rubble where their homes once stood. The injured were taken to hospitals, which quickly were overcrowded. Many had internal injuries, broken bones, eye injuries, concussions, and puncture wounds. Members of the Canadian, British, and American navies assisted with the search and rescue, going street by street, house to house, to find the injured. And Navy doctors and medics provided immediate assistance. Anyone with first aid training was conscripted to help triage the wounded. Some of the injured were taken aboard the USS Colony, which was quickly converted into a hospital ship by the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Other Navy ships and tugs assisted by transporting the injured to the docks nearest any available hospitals. Many more ships in the harbor had munitions on board, and all of them had been bombarded by flaming shrapnel. Additional munitions were stored in warehouses along the waterfront. Another explosion was a real danger, and military personnel were forced to act quickly. In a 1998 article of the Northern Mariner, John G. Armstrong wrote of Gunner William O'Reilly of the HMCS Niobe. O'Reilly assisted in clearing the munitions from nearby storage warehouses, saying, "We worked like slaves, pulling out cases of cordite and shells of all kinds, and dumped them in the water. It was a perfect miracle they did not go off, as the 3 buildings where they were stored had been completely wrecked, but luckily had not caught fire." Dispatcher Vincent Coleman's message turned out to be a heroic effort. His message notified other stations of a potential problem. When the line went dead, a train carrying doctors, nurses, and other first responders to the scene arrived shortly before noon. Soon after, trains from all over Nova Scotia and even New Brunswick arrived carrying volunteers and aid. The Canadian military was crucial in the rescue response following the tragic events. Almost immediately, tents were set up, blankets were distributed, and tools provided for search and rescue. It was December in Canada, and temperatures were frigid. Approximately 20,000 people had become displaced and had no shelter. The need to provide warmth, food, and shelter was immediate. Soldiers and sailors, many of them injured as well, selflessly assisted survivors and transported the injured. The American ships USS Tacoma and USS von Steuben saw the enormous mushroom cloud from the explosion while 50 kilometers out to sea. They raced to Halifax and volunteered all of their 1,200 crew to the rescue effort. Army recruit Carl Moulton wrote to his girlfriend, "We worked among the ruins for hours, had to improvise stretchers and take the injured to tugs and other boats to be carried to the hospital ships." There was little confusion, for the military took hold of the situation. Assistance even came from the Boston Red Cross and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, prompting the province of Nova Scotia to send them a Christmas tree in 1917, and then every year since 1971 as an annual remembrance of thanks. The suffering in Halifax and Dartmouth was of epic proportions following the explosion and resulting tsunami. Unfortunately, a horrible blizzard added to their misery the following day, the 7th of December 1917. Waist-deep snowdrifts added to the difficulty of rescue efforts and caused horrendous suffering for the 20,000 citizens who were now without shelter. Planning committees worked tirelessly to keep transportation paths open as they continued to pull bodies out of the wreckage. The area's 4 civilian and 4 military hospitals, as well as hospital ships, clinics, and infirmaries, were overwhelmed with the injured and sick. Hospital staff and military personnel worked tirelessly and endlessly to provide much-needed assistance. Emergency shelters popped up all over, at churches, the Knights of Columbus, theaters, schools, or any available building that could house the victims. Donations of money and materials poured in from all over Canada and the world as news of the emergency situation gradually spread. The Halifax Relief Commission gave $30 million, which included $750,000 from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In addition to money, building materials, stoves, furnaces, and clothing came from all over to help rebuild the devastated cities and provide comfort for its citizens. Trinidad-born Dr. Clement Courtney Lagour treated the injured and sick for weeks following the explosion. Lagour, a well-known figure in the Halifax community, was denied the right to work at local hospitals and clinics because of the color of his skin. He operated a private hospital and assisted in the relief and recovery of countless injured citizens. Reconstruction was slow at first. Over the coming months and years, hundreds of houses were built, dockyards and rail yards repaired, and business operations recovered. The suburb of Richmond no longer existed at the northern end of Halifax Peninsula. It was absorbed by the city of Halifax and is now an upscale residential and shopping district called the Hydrostone. The small neighborhood of Afriqueville on the southern shores of Bedford Basin was not destroyed, but was significantly damaged. Its population of black citizens received little to none of the relief money. Prejudices of the time forced out its residents, and the area was redeveloped. A court of inquiry convened on the 13th of December 1917 and was led by Justice Arthur Drysdale. The court issued its report on the 4th of February 1918, which blamed the Mont-Blanc's captain, Aimé Lemedec, the ship's pilot, Francis Mackey, and Commander F. Evan Wyatt of the Royal Canadian Navy, who was in charge of operations at Halifax Harbor. Commissioner L.A. Demer wrote, "It was the Mont-Blanc's responsibility alone to ensure that she avoided a collision at all costs, given her cargo." All 3 men were charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence. However, Nova Scotia Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Russell later found there was a lack of evidence, and all charges against Mackey and Captain Lemedec were dismissed. Charges remained against Commander Wyatt, and he was indicted on the 17th of April, 1918. He was later acquitted after a jury trial. Justice Drysdale also presided over a civil trial, brought by the owners of both ships involved in the accident. Drysdale found that the Mont-Blanc was entirely at fault, although an appeals court found that both ships were equally at fault, and neither party received a judgment. An estimated 2,000 people were killed as a result of the explosion and tsunami, including civilians and military personnel. Over 9,000 were injured, and 20,000 were rendered homeless. The Halifax Explosion of 1917 still remains the largest man-made, non-nuclear explosion in history. The city held a memorial in December of 1918, honoring the first anniversary of the tragedy. But events marking its anniversary were avoided for decades after. A 50th anniversary event was finally held in 1967. In 1964, construction of the Halifax North Memorial Library began, which included the Halifax Explosion Memorial Sculpture. This sculpture was later dismantled in 2004 by the Halifax Regional Municipality. The Halifax Explosion Memorial bells were constructed in 1985, using carillon bells from a nearby church. The bells were relocated to a large sculpture on Fort Needham Hill, directly facing the epicenter of the explosion. This bell tower is now the site of an annual ceremony on the 6th of December, honoring the memory of the tragedy. Another memorial at Halifax Fire Station No. 4 on Lady Hammond Road pays tribute to the volunteer firefighters killed in the explosion. Many other monuments and memorials dot the neighborhoods and cemeteries around Halifax and Dartmouth, paying tribute to the terrible loss of so many. That's going to do it for the Halifax Explosion of 1917. Thank you so much for listening. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show on social media at ShipwrecksPod or at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. There you can find links to images and sources related to this episode. You can help support the show with a donation through buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod. All donations help me continue to bring you great maritime stories. You can also subscribe to Into History. For ad-free listening to this and many other great history podcasts, go to intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. Original theme music for Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. Please join me again in 2 weeks. But until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.